The scorching August sun transformed Wyoming Territory's Great Divide Basin into a furnace of cracked earth and shimmering heat waves. In 1881, temperatures like these could strip the life from an unprepared traveler within hours, leaving only sun-bleached bones scattered across the hardpan for buzzards to pick clean. The vast wasteland stretched endlessly toward distant peaks that danced like phantoms in the superheated air, creating mirages that promised water where none existed for 100 miles in any direction. Tokala knelt beside a small figure, collapsed against a wind-carved boulder, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the child. She appeared no older than 8, her red dress torn and faded to the color of dried rust. Dust had transformed her pale lips into a cracked mask of suffering, while a thin line of blood marked the corner of her mouth like war paint applied by death itself. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that barely moved her fragile chest. At 48, Tokala bore the accumulated scars of a lifetime, spent navigating between two worlds that often viewed each other as enemies. His buckskin clothing darkened with perspiration and worn smooth by countless miles of frontier travel marked him as Lakota, while his ability to speak fluent English had earned him steady work as a scout for wagon trains, cavalry patrols, and mining expeditions throughout the territory. During those dangerous years, he had learned essential survival skills that went far beyond tracking and hunting, how to tie complex knots for securing loads and rigging emergency repairs, how to read terrain for signs of rock slides and flash floods, how pulleys and windlass systems worked in the mines where he sometimes guided supply wagons through treacherous underground passages. Long black hair braided with eagle feathers that caught the relentless sunlight framed a face carved by decades of hardship, loss, and the constant tension of living between cultures. Around his weathered neck hung a medicine pouch sewn by his grandmother. 40 winters past, its intricate beadwork faded, but still carrying the spiritual power of memory and tradition. His left knee throbbed with familiar agony. An old bullet wound from a Platte River skirmish had never healed properly, leaving him with a permanent limp that worsened each year and served as a constant reminder that even the strongest men carried invisible burdens. Water. The girl whispered, her voice barely audible, above the eternal wind that carried the scent of sage and the promise of death to those unprepared for its merciless embrace. Tokala's own throat felt raw as sandpaper, his tongue swollen from dehydration. But he uncapped his dented canteen without hesitation. The metal scalded his fingers like a branching iron, yet he tilted it with practiced care, allowing only precious drops to pass her cracked lips. In his mind, unbidden and painful as a knife thrust, came the memory of another dying child, his own daughter Winona. 5 winters passed, asking for water with the same desperate hope, while fever consumed her small body. He had failed her despite his frantic efforts to reach medical help. He would not fail this one. The memory of Winona's final night remained as clear as if it had happened yesterday. She had been delirious with fever, asking repeatedly for her mother, who had died 2 winters earlier, giving birth to a son who lived only 3 days. In her fevered state, Winona had clutched a small beaded charm. She had made herself its pattern, representing the 4 directions and the sacred hoop of life. When the fever finally took her, the charm had remained in her tiny fist, and Tokala had buried it with her, according to Lakota tradition, though keeping the memory of its intricate pattern burned forever into his heart. The girl's eyes fluttered open pale blue like winter sky over fresh snow, and focused on his sun-darkened features with obvious effort and a flicker of recognition. Not of him specifically, but of kindness in a world that had shown her only cruelty and abandonment. "Will I ever see my mother again?" she asked, her voice breaking like autumn leaves caught in a dying fire. The question struck him harder than any bullet ever had, awakening memories he had tried to bury beneath years of solitary travel and purposeful isolation from human connection. He placed his broad palm against her narrow chest, feeling her heart flutter like a trapped bird, desperate to escape its cage of failing flesh. Without immediate medical help, clean water and shelter from this furnace, she would join his daughter in the spirit world before another hour passed. The signs he had been tracking for 2 miles told their own grim story to eyes trained in reading the language of the wilderness. Drag marks in the sand showed where she had been pulled from somewhere else, probably a wagon or camp. A piece of moldy bread half devoured by hungry coyotes marked her desperate attempt to survive on scraps. Boot prints from 3 different men led away from wagon wheel ruts that spoke of ambush violence and careful planning rather than random attack. In her small fist, she clutched a broken locket containing the miniature portrait of a brown-haired woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Delicate blue stitching spelled out the initials EF on her dress hem, with the careful precision of a loving mother's hands. Without words knowing that speech would waste precious moisture and energy, neither of them could spare. Tokala lifted the child onto his broad shoulders, with movements as careful as a man handling sacred objects. She weighed no more than a half-empty grain sack, her frame, as delicate as the hollow bones of the prairie birds that rode the thermals above their heads. From his well-worn travel pack, he retrieved his ceremonial war bonnet, a magnificent creation of white eagle feathers and intricate beadwork that had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now served him in this most crucial battle. Not against human enemies, but against time distance and the killing heat of the desert. He began walking with the measured, economical pace of a man who understood that haste meant death in country like this, where the sun could bake the life out of a person in hours and the nearest water might be days away. Each step sent bolts of lightning-like pain through his damaged knee joint, and the old wound protesting against the additional weight and the unforgiving terrain. But he maintained steady forward progress with the grim determination of a man who had learned that survival often depended on the simple ability to keep moving when every instinct screamed for rest. Behind them, turkey buzzards wheeled in lazy, patient circles against the brilliant blue sky, their keen eyes marking the passage of potential prey, while their shadows moved across the baked earth like dark omens of mortality. The silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through distant rock formations and the soft, controlled sound of Tokala's breathing as he fought to maintain his strength and composure under the crushing weight of responsibility and physical agony. After 2 miles of agonizing travel across terrain that seemed designed to test human endurance to its absolute limits, Tokala recognized a familiar landmark, a carefully arranged pile of weathered stones that marked an old water cache he had helped establish during his scouting days years earlier. Hidden in the blessed shadow of an overhanging rock ledge, a sturdy wooden barrel still held several inches of warm but clean water, precious as gold in this wasteland, but life itself to 2 dying souls. He allowed himself a few precious sips, feeling the moisture penetrate his parched tissues like rain on drought-cracked earth before focusing entirely on the girl's needs. She managed to swallow small amounts without becoming sick, which he took as an encouraging sign that her condition might be stabilizing rather than continuing its downward spiral toward death. Using his sharp hunting knife and supple willow branches growing near the water source. One of nature's small miracles in this harsh landscape, Tokala constructed a simple but effective travois. The task required him to remove his colorful woven sash, a wedding gift from his beloved wife Ayana, whose gentle hands had created the bright patterns during the early days of their marriage. It pained him deeply to use her precious handiwork this way, converting a symbol of love into a tool of survival. But he knew she would have understood and approved. She had always believed that their possessions existed to preserve life, not to gather dust as monuments to the past. As they resumed their journey toward Dusty Fork, 12 miles distant across some of the most unforgiving terrain in Wyoming Territory, a pack of coyotes began following. At a respectful distance, their yellow eyes gleaming with predatory interest and animal cunning. These were not the domestic dogs of civilization, but wild hunters perfectly adapted to this harsh environment. and they recognized the scent of approaching death with the same accuracy that vultures spotted carrion from miles away. Tokala fired a warning shot from his well-maintained Colt revolver, the sharp report echoing across the empty landscape like thunder in the desert silence. The recoil jarred his injured knee painfully, sending fresh waves of agony up his leg and causing him to stumble briefly on the uneven ground. The coyotes scattered into the brush with disappointed whines, but his moment of weakness had shown them that their patience might eventually be rewarded. He could not afford such displays of vulnerability, not with an innocent life depending entirely on his strength and determination. The girl stirred on the travois as the buildings of Dusty Fork began to take shape through the heat haze, like a mirage slowly becoming real. For a moment, her fever-clouded eyes cleared with surprising lucidity. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, before consciousness faded again like smoke in the wind. It was enough to kindle a small flame of hope in his weathered heart, suggesting that his agonizing journey across the desert had not been undertaken entirely in vain. Dusty Fork had mushroomed around the Union Pacific Railroad like a frontier boomtown, and after rain its buildings representing an eclectic mixture of hasty construction designed for immediate profit and more permanent stone structures built by people who intended to stay and build a real community. The town served as supply depot for surrounding mines and cattle ranches, a place where fortunes rose and fell with each passing train, carrying goods, dreams, and desperate people eastward toward civilization or westward toward opportunity and danger in equal measure. The population fluctuated wildly between 300 and 1,000 souls, depending on mining success, seasonal cattle drives, and the periodic boom and bust cycles that characterized frontier economics. Deputy Caleb Holt was making his routine evening rounds along Main Street when he spotted the highly unusual sight of a Lakota warrior pulling a makeshift travois through town in broad daylight. At 32, Caleb stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, earned through years of backbreaking farm work in Kansas before drought and bank foreclosures had driven his family west in search of new opportunities. His steady gray eyes missed nothing of importance, a survival trait developed during 3 years serving as deputy under Sheriff Harlan Pike in an increasingly uncomfortable arrangement as Pike's corruption and moral compromises became more blatant and harder to ignore. Afternoon. Caleb said, carefully approaching with the professional caution of a lawman who had learned to read situations quickly, but avoiding the automatic suspicion that characterized too many of his colleagues when dealing with Indians. "Looks like you've had some mighty hard traveling in this heat." Tokala stopped his painful progress and studied the deputy's face with the focused intensity of a man whose survival had often depended on his ability to read character quickly and accurately in dangerous situations. What he saw encouraged him honesty in Caleb's upright posture, directness in his unflinching gaze, and genuine concern rather than reflexive hostility. Increasingly rare qualities among frontier lawmen in his experience. "The child needs help immediately." Tokala replied simply as carefully pronounced English, colored by the musical rhythms and precise consonants of his native Lakota. "Clean water, proper medicine, safe shelter, where she can recover her strength." Caleb knelt beside the travois and examined the torn fabric and dried blood that told a story he had encountered far too often during his years as a frontier lawman. Violence against the innocent was becoming disturbingly common as more settlers pushed into territory that had once known only the natural law of survival of the fittest, and the collision between different ways of life often produced tragic casualties. "What happened to her?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline of an answer that would probably involve greed, violence, and the kind of casual cruelty that seemed to flourish in lawless places far from civilization's restraining influences. "I found her in the desert, abandoned and left to die by whoever hurt her." Tokala explained with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being believed when he spoke the truth. "Someone attacked her badly, then left her for the sun and buzzards to finish." She carries a locket with a woman's picture inside, and there are initials carefully sewn into her dress. E.F. Recognition immediately tightened Caleb's expression with anger and growing understanding of the situation's true dimensions. He knew those initials very well indeed. Eleanor Finch worked at the laundry operation behind the Ash River Mine Complex, 20 miles north of town. Through dangerous country. For weeks, she had been making desperate inquiries around Dusty Fork about her missing daughter, filing official reports that Sheriff Pike had dismissed with increasing irritation as the hysterical complaints of an overwrought woman whose emotional state made her an unreliable witness. Now it seemed her maternal fears had been entirely justified, and Pike's studied indifference was taking on a much more sinister cast that suggested corruption rather than mere incompetence. From across the dusty street, a young woman emerged from the one-room schoolhouse carrying a worn leather medical bag that had seen extensive frontier use. Louisa Pike was 24 years old, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun that stayed secure during long hours of teaching and medical work, and intelligent brown eyes that reflected both deep compassion for human suffering and iron determination to fight injustice wherever she encountered it. She served dual roles as the town's school teacher and, in the absence of a proper doctor, the unofficial medical practitioner who handled emergencies with skill learned through harsh necessity and natural talent. Her connection to the corrupt sheriff was a source of constant personal tension and moral conflict. Harlan was her older brother by nearly 20 years, but their approaches to life duty and morality could not have been more different. Where he saw opportunities for personal profit and easy money, she saw responsibilities to the community and obligations to help those who could not help themselves. Where he chose the comfortable path of corruption and moral compromise, she chose the more difficult road of integrity and service to others, regardless of personal cost. Caleb, what's happening here? She called out, hurrying across the street with quick, purposeful steps that spoke of professional urgency and deep concern. When she saw the girl's condition, unconscious, dehydrated, showing clear signs of trauma and abandonment, her expression immediately shifted to one of focused medical assessment, mixed with righteous anger at whoever had caused such suffering to an innocent child. Bring her to the school immediately. She ordered with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to taking charge during medical emergencies. I have clean water, proper medical supplies, and a quiet place where she can rest safely while we determine the extent of her injuries and what needs to be done to help her recover. Together, they carefully carried the unconscious girl into the schoolhouse, where Louisa had converted a corner of the building into a makeshift but well-equipped infirmary. The space included a comfortable cot with clean linens, changed regularly, a cabinet filled with basic medical supplies purchased with her own meager teacher's salary, and the kind of organized efficiency that spoke of someone who had learned to treat everything from mining accidents to gunshot wounds in a town that saw more than its fair share of violence and trauma. As Louisa began her thorough examination, cleaning accumulated dust and dried blood from the girl's face and hands, with gentle precision, she noticed something distinctly unusual about the stitching on the dress hem. The thread used was different in both color and quality from that used in the rest of the garment, and the needlework showed the kind of particular care and attention to detail that suggested special significance beyond mere repairs. Using her small scissors with the delicate touch of someone accustomed to precise work, she carefully opened a section of the seemingly innocent hem and made a discovery that changed everything: a piece of oiled cloth wrapped around a tightly folded paper that had been sewn into the dress lining with obvious intent to keep it hidden from casual observation. The note was written in careful feminine handwriting that spoke of education, refinement, and desperate urgency. If found, deliver Mabel Finch to Eleanor Finch at Ash River Mine Laundry. Do not trust Sheriff Pike or Silas Thorne. The water claim is hers by law. E.F. Louisa and Caleb exchanged meaningful glances that spoke volumes about their shared understanding of local politics, corruption, and the dangerous forces that shaped life in Wyoming Territory. The mention of Silas Thorne's name cast the entire situation in a much darker and more threatening light that explained the violence and desperation they had already witnessed. Silas Thorne was widely recognized as one of the most powerful and ruthlessly ambitious men in Wyoming Territory. A self-made empire builder who owned vast tracts of prime ranch land, several highly profitable mining claims, and significant financial interests in the railroad that connected their isolated region to eastern markets and political power. More ominously, he was also known throughout the territory to control Sheriff Pike through a deadly combination of political influence, financial dependency, and gambling debts that had grown far beyond the sheriff's ability to repay through honest wages or legal means. "My name is Tokala," the warrior said quietly, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the room as the implications of the hidden message became clear to all of them. "I will take the girl to her mother safely, as the note requests and as honor demands." Caleb shook his head, with the grim understanding of a man who had seen what happened to people who crossed powerful interests in lawless territory. "Friend, I don't think you fully understand what you're volunteering yourself for here. Ash River and everything around it might as well be a nest of angry hornets, and Silas Thorne is definitely the biggest, meanest, most dangerous hornet of them all. If this note is accurate about water claims and legal disputes, and he's determined to get control of whatever rights this child represents, he won't hesitate for 1 second to kill anyone who gets in his way." Tokala's expression remained completely calm and resolute, but his dark eyes held the kind of steely determination that could only be forged through decades of facing death and refusing to be intimidated by the prospect of facing it again for a worthy cause. "I have carried sticks to stir hornet nests before deputy. The girl asked me if she would ever see her mother again. I gave her my word that she would, and I intend to keep that promise, regardless of the personal cost." Louisa finished her preliminary medical examination, checking the girl's pulse temperature and general condition with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that careful diagnosis could mean the difference between life and death in frontier medicine. "She's severely dehydrated and completely exhausted, but I believe she'll recover with proper rest, regular fluids, and basic medical care. The real question now is how to get her safely to Ash River without alerting Thorne's network of informants and hired guns to our intentions and location." As if her words had somehow summoned them from the gathering dusk, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears through the schoolhouse windows. Across the railroad tracks that divided the town, 2 armed riders sat motionless on their mounts, clearly observing the building with professional interest and obvious hostile intent. One raised a rifle in what could have been interpreted as either direct threat or some kind of signal to unseen Confederates, while the other made a whistling sound remarkably similar to a hawk's hunting call, clearly some kind of prearranged communication system. The message was absolutely unmistakable to anyone with experience reading frontier dangers. They had been seen identified, and word was already spreading through Thorne's extensive network of paid informants and professional killers. Caleb drew his service revolver with the smooth efficiency of a man who had learned to react quickly to developing threats and then moved to the window, where he could observe the watchers while keeping most of his body protected by the building's solid log walls. "Looks like those hornets already know we're here and exactly what we're doing, and they're definitely not happy about the situation." The approaching darkness brought with it both increased opportunity for covert movement and significantly escalated danger from enemies who knew the territory better than they did. Tokala, Louisa, and Caleb realized with growing urgency that they had to move Mabel quickly and quietly before Thorne's men could organize a proper response that would overwhelm their limited resources and result in capture or death for all of them. The railroad offered their best option for rapid covert travel, a maintenance handcar that work crews used to travel between stations along sections of track that saw little nighttime traffic from regular trains. By using the rails, they could avoid the main roads where armed patrols would certainly be watching for them, and with luck, reach the Sable Junction area by dawn, before their enemies could predict their movements or set up effective ambushes. Caleb had requisitioned the handcar from the railroad yard, using his official authority, leaving a carefully worded signed note that promised to return the equipment undamaged and accepted full personal responsibility for its emergency use. As a sworn deputy sheriff, he had some legal authority to commandeer civilian equipment during official emergencies, though he knew perfectly well that Sheriff Pike would never approve of this particular creative interpretation of his duties and responsibilities. They loaded Mabel, now wrapped in clean blankets and showing encouraging signs of gradual improvement, onto the handcar's small platform, while Louisa packed essential medical supplies and whatever food they could carry without being too heavily burdened for quick movement. The girl had awakened briefly during the transfer to drink more water and eat a few small bites of bread, which Louisa interpreted as very encouraging signs that her condition was stabilizing rather than continuing to deteriorate. The handcar moved smoothly along the steel rails with a rhythmic clicking sound that was oddly soothing, its well-maintained wheels carrying them forward through the cool night air that provided blessed relief from the day's brutal, punishing heat. Tokala and Caleb took turns at the pumping mechanism that propelled them steadily forward, while Louisa continued monitoring Mabel's vital signs and watching carefully for any deterioration in her condition that might require immediate medical intervention. "You know something," Caleb said quietly during his turn at the lever, his voice thoughtful as he worked to maintain their steady pace. "I've been wearing this deputy's badge for 3 years now, and this is honestly the first time I can remember feeling like I'm actually serving justice instead of just blindly following orders from corrupt superiors. Justice is not always found written in law books or carved in courthouse stone." Tokala replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom and personal experience with both legal and natural forms of justice. "Sometimes it lives only in the hearts of those who are willing to act, when others will not, even when such action brings great personal risk and sacrifice." Their philosophical conversation was interrupted as they approached the Sweetwater River crossing, where their borrowed saddle horse began acting strangely, snorting nervously, and shying away from something hidden in the darkness beside the railroad tracks. Caleb dismounted carefully to investigate the source of the animal's obvious distress, and what he found coiled among the wooden railroad ties made his blood run cold. A massive diamondback rattlesnake, easily 6 feet long and thick as a strong man's arm, with the distinctive markings that identified it as one of the most deadly reptiles in all of North America. Before anyone could react or take defensive action, the snake struck with the lightning speed that made it such a feared predator, its hollow fangs sinking deep into the horse's front leg and pumping concentrated venom directly into the bloodstream with ruthless efficiency. The stricken animal collapsed immediately, thrashing in pain and terror as the powerful toxin began shutting down its nervous system with inexorable precision. Caleb ended the horse's suffering with a single merciful gunshot, but they now faced a serious tactical problem that threatened to derail their entire rescue mission. The handcar had been specifically designed to be pulled by horses or mules across difficult terrain, where the railroad tracks might be damaged under construction or simply non-existent. Without their essential animal power, they would be forced to push the heavy device manually across the high railroad bridge that spanned the rushing river below, a magnificent feat of engineering. That was also a potential death trap for anyone caught on its exposed length when a locomotive approached at full speed. The bridge stretched nearly 200 feet across the rocky canyon, with the steel rails offering the only safe walkway for humans, and dangerous gaps between the wooden cross ties that could easily catch an unwary foot or the handcar's wheels if they weren't extremely careful. As they began the exhausting process of pushing their burden onto the bridge's exposed span, a distant train whistle echoed through the canyon, like the lonesome cry of some mechanical ghost warning them that their time was rapidly running out. A freight train loaded with ore and supplies was approaching steadily from the east, still several miles away, but closing the distance with the relentless precision of tons of steel traveling at speeds that would reduce human flesh to nothing more than a bloody smear on the tracks. They had perhaps 10 minutes at most to cross the entire span and clear the opposite side before being caught directly in the path of certain destruction with no possibility of escape once they were committed to the crossing. The alternative option, abandoning the handcar and attempting to carry Mabel across the treacherous bridge on foot, was equally unappealing since her condition remained too fragile for such physical exertion, and the gaps between cross ties made foot travel extremely dangerous, even for healthy adults in good physical condition. Halfway across the bridge with the train's brilliant headlight, now clearly visible as a growing star in the eastern darkness, and the sound of its powerful engine growing steadily louder with each passing second, a rifle shot cracked through the night air like a whip. The bullet struck the wooden rail beside Tokala's hand with tremendous force, sending sharp splinters flying in all directions and nearly causing him to lose his desperate grip on the handcar's handle. More shots followed in rapid succession from multiple positions along the riverbank, far below, confirming their worst fears that Thorne's men had somehow anticipated their route and prepared a carefully coordinated ambush at the bridge crossing. With absolutely nowhere to hide on the exposed span and the freight train bearing down on them like an iron avalanche of destruction, their situation had become desperately critical with no obvious solution that didn't involve significant casualties. Caleb returned fire with his lever-action rifle, the bright muzzle flashes illuminating his grim, determined face in the darkness, while he made every shot count in this life-or-death engagement. His marksmanship training and frontier experience served him well. One of his carefully aimed rounds found its intended mark, and they heard a man cry out in pain, followed by the distant splash of a body hitting the swift-running water far below the bridge. "Keep pushing with everything you've got," Louisa shouted over the growing cacophony of gunfire and the approaching train's increasingly urgent whistle warnings that echoed off the canyon walls like the screams of a dying giant. She had thrown herself protectively over Mabel's fragile form, shielding the girl's body with her own, while continuing to help move the handcar forward through sheer determination and physical effort that pushed her far beyond what she had ever imagined herself capable of achieving. Tokala's injured knee was sending waves of excruciating agony up his entire leg pain, so intense it threatened to buckle his leg completely and send him tumbling off the bridge to certain death. But he channeled every ounce of his remaining strength and life experience into moving that handcar forward one impossible inch at a time. The freight train was less than a mile away, now its whistle shrieking warnings that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the bridge structure itself. Behind them, more rifle shots continued to split the night, but the remaining ambushers appeared to be pulling back, perhaps unwilling to risk being caught on or near the bridge, when several hundred tons of locomotive and cars arrived at full speed. With 50 yards remaining to the safety of solid ground, disaster struck when the handcar hit a section of warped rail and nearly derailed completely, threatening to spill them all into the rocky chasm below. Tokala grabbed Mabel's unconscious form and held her securely, while Caleb and Louisa struggled desperately to get the stubborn wheels back on track, their hands torn and bleeding from the rough metal and splintered wood as they fought against time and mechanical failure. The train's brilliant light was now close enough to cast long, dancing shadows across the bridge structure, revealing every detail of their precarious situation with merciless clarity. They had perhaps 2 minutes, maybe less, before the locomotive reached them. The final yards seemed to stretch like hours in some nightmare version of time, where seconds moved like molasses, each moment elongated by desperation and the absolute certainty of approaching death. Finally, through supreme effort and what could only be described as miraculous fortune, they managed to roll off the bridge onto solid ground just as the freight train thundered past with a roar, like the end of the world, its cars clattering and banging together in a symphony of industrial violence that shook the earth beneath their feet. In the locomotive's brilliant headlight beam, they caught a brief but clear glimpse of the bridge they had just crossed, empty now, except for scattered debris from their desperate escape and the echo of their racing heartbeats. Tokala's knee had swollen to nearly twice its normal size during the harrowing crossing the joint, so inflamed and damaged that he could barely put any weight on it at all. Using his sharp hunting knife, he cut strips of buckskin from his shirt and wrapped the injury tightly, creating a makeshift bandage that would provide some structural support, but could do nothing for the constant grinding pain that threatened to overwhelm his concentration and determination. Mabel's fever had returned with concerning intensity, but she remained conscious enough to drink water without becoming violently sick, which Louisa interpreted as a hopeful sign that her body was still fighting the effects of dehydration and trauma. Most importantly, from a tactical standpoint, Caleb had managed to recover a spent cartridge case from one of the ambushers during the confusion of the firefight, a distinctive .44-40 caliber bullet casing with a carefully filed edge that he recognized immediately from his law enforcement experience. "This belongs to Vance Proctor without any doubt," he announced grimly, holding up the brass evidence for the others to examine. "He's Thorne's chief enforcer and professional killer, and he files the edges of his bullets because he believes it makes them more deadly and painful. Now we have solid physical proof directly linking Thorne's criminal organization to these attacks. But having proof would be completely meaningless if they did not survive long enough to present it to someone with both the authority and the moral integrity to act decisively on such evidence. They were still 20 dangerous miles from Ash River, forced to travel through territory that Thorne controlled as completely as any medieval lord had ever controlled his feudal domain, with networks of informants, hired guns, and corrupt officials who would kill them without hesitation if given the opportunity. And now, the most powerful man in Wyoming Territory knew exactly where they were headed, why they were going there, and approximately when they would arrive. The rising action intensified dramatically with the arrival of Dawn in Dusty Fork, where they had been forced to take temporary shelter in Louisa's schoolhouse after abandoning the damaged handcar that could no longer serve their transportation needs. The building offered certain tactical advantages, including multiple exits for emergency escape and clear sight lines that allowed them to detect approaching threats from several directions, but it also made them easy targets if Thorne's men decided to attack in overwhelming force with enough firepower to simply destroy the building and everyone inside it. Sheriff Harlan Pike arrived with the sunrise, his timing suggesting that he had been informed of their location and activities through Thorne's extensive intelligence network. He was accompanied by 2 men whose appearance, bearing, and equipment clearly marked them as professional gunfighters rather than legitimate law enforcement officers, the kind of hired killers who sold their services to the highest bidder without regard for legal niceties or moral considerations. Pike himself was 45 years old with prematurely graying hair and the soft, unhealthy physique that spoke eloquently of too many years spent accepting bribes and kickbacks instead of chasing actual criminals across difficult terrain. His relationship with his sister Louisa was complicated by their fundamentally different moral perspectives and life choices. She had inherited their deceased mother's strong sense of community responsibility and justice for all people, regardless of social status, while he had adopted their late father's weakness for easy money, personal comfort, and the path of least resistance in all moral and professional matters. "I am mourning, sister dear," Pike said with obviously false courtesy, touching his hat brim in a mockery of gentlemanly behavior that fooled no one present. "I understand you're currently harboring a kidnapped child and the dangerous savage who took her from her proper legal guardians." "That's a complete and utter lie, Harlan, and you know it perfectly well," Louisa replied with barely controlled anger and the kind of icy contempt that could only exist between family members who had chosen opposite sides in a fundamental moral conflict. "This man risked his own life to rescue Mabel Finch from certain death in the desert where she was deliberately abandoned by whoever attacked her family's wagon." Pike produced an official-looking document from his coat pocket with theatrical ceremony, unfolding it slowly as if its contents were of tremendous legal significance. "This here's a properly executed court order declaring the girl an orphan ward of Wyoming Territory, signed personally by Judge Morrison himself, with all appropriate seals and documentation. I'm here in my official capacity to take legal custody of her for her own protection and welfare, as required by territorial law." Tokala stepped forward without the slightest hesitation, positioning his weathered body directly between Pike and the recovering girl. With a presence that seemed to fill the entire doorway, despite his relatively modest physical stature. He carried no weapons openly, but something in his bearing and the quiet intensity of his dark eyes made him appear as immovable as a boulder that had been shaped by centuries of wind and weather into an instrument of absolute resistance. "The girl stays with me until I deliver her safely to her mother, exactly as I promised her," he stated with calm finality, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of making difficult decisions and accepting their consequences regardless of personal cost. Caleb examined the purported court order with the trained eye of a lawman who had learned to spot forged documents, altered evidence, and other forms of legal fraud during his years of frontier law enforcement. Something about the document immediately aroused his professional suspicions, and after several minutes of careful study, he realized exactly what was wrong with it. "This order is dated yesterday. Harlan," he announced with growing anger and certainty. "But Judge Morrison left town for Cheyenne on official territorial business 3 days ago. I personally saw him board the eastbound train at the station, along with half the town who came to see him off." Pike's face flushed dark red with embarrassment, anger, and the unmistakable look of a man whose deception had been exposed publicly. But he maintained his official composure with visible effort and attempted to bluster his way through the confrontation. Clerical mistakes happen with dates all the time in busy government offices. The important thing here is the judge's official signature and the territorial seal that makes this a legitimate legal document. A signature that was obviously forged by someone after the judge left town, and a seal that can be duplicated by anyone with access to the right equipment. Caleb stated flatly, his voice carrying the full authority of his office and his reputation for honesty and competence. "That makes this document completely worthless from a legal standpoint. And your attempt to use it to seize custody of this child constitutes federal fraud, kidnapping, and probably several other serious crimes that I'd be happy to arrest you for right here and now." The corrupt sheriff's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, a reflexive gesture that spoke of years spent using violence and intimidation to solve problems that should have been handled through legal means and proper police work. But he seemed to reconsider his options when he saw the quiet determination burning in Tokala's eyes and the professional readiness visible in Caleb's stance. Both men were clearly prepared for whatever violence Pike might attempt to unleash. Instead of drawing his weapon, Pike backed toward the door with barely controlled rage, twisting his features into an ugly mask that revealed the true nature of the man behind the badge and official authority. "You're all making the biggest mistake of your lives," he snarled with genuine menace and the kind of cold fury that promised terrible retribution. "Silas Thorne has resources and connections throughout this territory that you can't begin to imagine. And patience definitely ain't one of his virtues. If you won't hand over the girl through proper legal channels, he'll find another way to take her, and that way won't be nearly as pleasant for any of you." After the sheriff's departure, which left an atmosphere of tension and barely suppressed violence hanging in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, they moved quickly to the telegraph office, where elderly operator Simeon Reed had something absolutely crucial to show them. Simeon was widely recognized as one of the few completely honest and incorruptible men remaining in Dusty Fork, too old and cantankerous to be successfully bribed or intimidated by Thorne's extensive corruption network. For many months, he had been secretly intercepting and copying telegraphic messages between Thorne and his various business associates, criminal confederates, and political allies throughout the region, hoping to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy that was slowly strangling the territory's honest citizens and legitimate businesses. This particular message came through the wire just about an hour ago. Simeon explained with obvious excitement and righteous anger, handing Caleb a telegraph form with hands that shook slightly from age and the adrenaline of finally being able to strike back at the forces of corruption. Thorne's officially declaring the Finch girl dead, supposedly killed in a savage Indian attack on her family's wagon. The message claims he's filing papers with the territorial government in Cheyenne to seize her inheritance as compensation for damages to his property and business interests. The intercepted telegram revealed Thorne's complete strategic plan with chilling clarity and ruthless efficiency. Mabel's father had been a professional surveyor with extensive knowledge of territorial land law, and he had filed completely legitimate water claims at Red Mesa before his untimely death from fever 2 years earlier. Those extremely valuable water rights had passed automatically to Mabel as his only legal heir under territorial inheritance law. But she was obviously too young to manage such valuable and complex assets herself, without proper adult supervision and legal representation. If she were officially declared dead by territorial authorities, those crucial water rights would revert to territorial government control and be sold at public auction to the highest bidder. And Thorne had accumulated enough political influence, bribery money, and connections with corrupt officials to virtually guarantee that he would be the only bidder allowed to participate in such an auction, regardless of its supposed public nature. The water flowing from Red Mesa fed both Thorne's extensive mining operations and his vast cattle ranches throughout a significant portion of the region, representing the lifeblood that sustained his entire business empire. Without guaranteed legal access to that essential water supply, his operations would collapse completely within a single drought season, taking with them the fortunes of everyone who depended on his enterprises for their livelihoods. Mabel represented the only remaining legal obstacle to his complete control of the area's most valuable and strategically important natural resource. "We need to get word to a territorial marshal as quickly as possible," Caleb declared with growing urgency and determination. Someone with authority that supersedes local sheriffs and complete independence from Thorne's political influence and financial corruption. But their communication and planning efforts were violently interrupted by the arrival of immediate physical danger in the form of armed enemies who clearly intended to end their resistance through direct action rather than legal maneuvering. 3 heavily armed riders approached the telegraph office at full gallop, rifles already drawn and ready for immediate use in what was obviously intended to be a lethal assault rather than merely an intimidating demonstration of force. Tokala's reflexes, honed by decades of frontier survival, kicked in instantly. He grabbed Mabel's still fragile form and dove behind the sturdy wooden counter that served the telegraph operator, pulling the girl to safety just as bullets began flying through the air where they had been standing moments before. Louisa reacted with equal speed and presence of mind, overturning a heavy desk to provide additional cover and protection from the incoming gunfire that was already shattering windows and splintering wooden walls throughout the small building. The attack was clearly planned and coordinated, with the 3 gunmen positioned to create crossfire that would trap anyone inside the building and make escape virtually impossible. Bullets filled the air like deadly hail, some punching through the thin wooden walls, while others struck metal equipment and created dangerous ricochets that could wound or kill from unexpected angles. Caleb returned fire through a broken window with the calm precision of a man who had learned to shoot accurately, under pressure, his shots measured and deliberate, despite the chaos surrounding them, and the very real possibility that they were all about to die in this small frontier telegraph office. One of his carefully aimed rounds found its intended target. They heard one of the attackers cry out in pain and saw him fall from his horse, clutching a shoulder wound that would probably put him out of the fight permanently. But the other 2 gunmen continued their relentless assault while circling the building like hunting wolves, seeking the best angle of attack, their horses trained for combat, and responding to their riders' commands with the precision of military cavalry mounts. Louisa, thinking quickly under the extreme pressure of life-threatening combat, spotted a large burlap sack filled with lime powder that was used for mixing construction mortar and making basic repairs to the building's foundation. With remarkable accuracy born of desperation and natural athletic ability, She hurled the heavy sack directly at one of the passing horses just as it galloped past the front entrance of the building. The caustic powder struck the animal directly in its sensitive eyes, with devastating effect, causing immediate chemical burns and temporary blindness that sent the horse into a panic. It reared up on its hind legs in pain and terror, throwing its rider with tremendous force against the wooden sidewalk where he landed with a sickening impact that left him motionless and probably unconscious, if not worse. The remaining gunman, seeing two of his companions down and recognizing that the element of surprise had been lost, began to retreat from the immediate area. His withdrawal was hastened by the appearance of more townspeople who emerged from nearby buildings carrying shotguns, hunting rifles, and various other weapons that they had grabbed when the shooting started. Most of Dusty Fork's citizens had grown increasingly tired of Thorne's heavy-handed tactics, systematic intimidation, and the climate of fear that his criminal organization had imposed on their community. Seeing a helpless child under direct armed attack had finally stirred their collective protective instincts and basic sense of human decency to the point where they were willing to risk personal danger to defend innocent victims of criminal violence. As they prepared to leave Dusty Fork for the extremely dangerous journey to Ash River Mine, they borrowed essential transportation in the form of a sturdy two-wheeled cart and a reliable burro from the local stable owner. A decent man who had always treated his customers fairly and maintained his equipment in excellent condition, Caleb insisted on leaving payment equal to more than a full month's deputy wages to ensure they could not possibly be charged with theft or any other crime related to their emergency use of private property, demonstrating his commitment to maintaining legal and moral standards even in the most desperate circumstances. The cart would allow them to travel significantly faster than proceeding on foot, while providing some measure of protection for Mabel during the rough journey ahead through territory that was likely to be actively hostile. A major thunderstorm was building ominously in the western mountains, bringing the kind of sudden violent weather that could transform normally dry creek beds into raging torrents capable of sweeping away horses and riders within minutes. But the approaching storm would also provide essential concealment from Thorne's mounted patrols that would otherwise be able to spot them from miles away across the open terrain. As they drove the cart along a barely visible trail that wound through dense sagebrush, scattered boulders, and the kind of rough country that could break an axle or lame a horse, if traversed carelessly, more armed riders appeared on the ridge behind them, like gathering storm clouds that promised violence and death. 3 men mounted on fast horses that were obviously well suited for pursuit across difficult terrain, steadily gaining ground despite the cart's lighter weight and greater maneuverability on the narrow trail. Rifle shots began ringing out across the desert landscape with increasing frequency and accuracy, the bullets kicking up small explosions of dust and rock fragments around the cart's iron-rimmed wheels as their pursuers found the range and began to close the distance between predator and prey. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing minute. They're closing the gap faster than I'd like. Caleb observed with professional calm, twisting in his seat to return accurate fire with his lever-action rifle, while trying to maintain his balance on the bouncing, swaying cart. We need some kind of tactical advantage, or we're going to be overtaken within the next mile or two. Tokala, drawing on strategic thinking developed during his years as a scout for military units and wagon trains, remembered a technique that had served him well in previous dangerous situations. Instead of trying to outrun their pursuers in a straight line where superior horseflesh would inevitably prevail, he began deliberately weaving the cart between large boulders and natural rock formations, using the challenging terrain to break their enemy's line of sight and force them to spread out in order to maintain effective pursuit. When they reached a narrow ravine that offered perfect terrain for an improvised ambush, he suddenly brought the cart to a complete stop and began unhitching the burro with movements that appeared calm and deliberate despite the approaching danger. "What in blazes are you doing?" Louisa asked with understandable alarm, glancing back at their pursuers who were now close enough that individual faces could be distinguished and the specific types of weapons they carried could be clearly identified, creating a tactical advantage through superior use of terrain. Tokala replied with the confidence of a man who had survived many similar situations through careful planning and precise execution rather than luck or superior firepower. They must come through this ravine in single file now, which eliminates their numerical advantage and gives us the opportunity to engage them on more favorable terms. He positioned the cart to partially block the ravine's narrow entrance, creating an obstacle that would force their pursuers to slow down and present better targets while limiting their ability to maneuver or retreat quickly if the engagement turned against them. When the first rider entered the confined space of the ravine, moving cautiously but still clearly visible against the rocky walls, Caleb was waiting with a clear field of fire and perfect shooting conditions. His carefully aimed shot took the man cleanly from his saddle, the impact of the heavy bullet spinning him around before he crashed to the ground and lay motionless. The second rider, seeing his companion fall and recognizing that they had ridden into a carefully prepared trap, tried to retreat back up the ravine, but found his escape route blocked by the third member of their group, who was still pushing forward, unaware of the changed tactical situation. In the resulting confusion, with horses colliding and men shouting contradictory orders while trying to control panicked animals in a confined space, Louisa seized the perfect opportunity to throw her remaining lime powder at the lead horse. The caustic chemical struck the animal directly in the face, causing immediate pain and temporary blindness that sent it into a frenzy of bucking and rearing that made accurate shooting impossible for its rider while creating complete chaos among all three pursuers and their mounts. Using the confusion and tactical advantage they had created, Tokala quickly re-hitched the burro and drove them out of the ravine through a secondary exit that he had spotted during his initial survey of the terrain. They escaped into a grove of tall cottonwood trees beside a seasonal creek, where the soft ground muffled the sound of their passage and the dense foliage provided visual concealment from their frustrated pursuers, who could be heard shouting angrily as they tried to reorganize and continue the chase without knowing exactly which direction their quarry had taken. They sought emergency shelter from the approaching storm at a small isolated fishing cabin beside the creek, where an unexpected ally emerged from the doorway. Just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, and lightning started to flicker on the western horizon, Jeb Coulter stepped into the fading daylight, immediately recognizable by the violent coughing fits that spoke eloquently of the lung disease that was slowly but inevitably killing him. After too many years of breathing poorly ventilated air in dangerous mining operations. At 53, Jeb was visibly marked by decades of dangerous labor in Thorne's mining empire. His once powerful frame now gaunt and wasted, while his breathing had become chronically labored and painful. But his eyes remained sharp and intelligent, missing nothing of importance. And he immediately recognized something significant about the girl that Tokala carried so protectively in his arms. I've seen that particular dress before, and recently too. Jeb announced with obvious excitement, pointing at Mabel's distinctive torn red garment, with a trembling finger that spoke of both physical weakness and emotional intensity. Her mother was stitching that exact hem just last week, while sitting beside the mine laundry working by lamplight after her regular duties were finished. Eleanor Finch, good decent woman, who's been asking everyone in 3 counties about her missing daughter filing reports and pleading for help from anyone who would listen. Jeb invited them inside his modest but comfortable refuge, which had become his permanent home since being systematically fired from his position as mine foreman at Ash River, and then blacklisted throughout Wyoming Territory for the supposed crime of talking to newspaper reporters about unsafe working conditions, environmental destruction, and the widespread use of illegal child labor in Thorne's extensive mining operations. I can tell you the complete story of what's been happening here and why that little girl represents such a deadly threat to Silas Thorne's empire. Jeb offered with obvious satisfaction at finally being able to strike back at the system that had destroyed his livelihood and threatened his life. He poured them coffee from a battered tin pot that had clearly seen many years of frontier use while organizing his thoughts and preparing to reveal information that could change everything. Mabel's father was a professional surveyor named Thomas Finch, an educated man who understood territorial water law better than most trained lawyers and knew exactly how to file proper legal claims that would stand up in any honest court. Jeb explained with the precision of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about these events and their implications. He filed completely legitimate claims at Red Mesa before fever took him 2 years back, and that water source feeds half the county, including absolutely all of Thorne's business operations, from mining to cattle ranching. The water rights had passed automatically to Mabel as her father's only legal heir under well-established territorial inheritance laws. But she was obviously far too young to manage such valuable and complex assets without proper adult supervision and legal representation. Eleanor had married Silas Thorne approximately 6 months after her husband's untimely death, motivated partly by the need for protection in dangerous territory, where a widow with a young child faced constant threats, and partly because Thorne had been courting her persistently with promises of security, prosperity, and a stable home for her daughter. But Thorne's greed eventually got the better of his common sense, and whatever genuine feelings he might have had for Eleanor, Jeb continued with obvious disgust and moral outrage. He forged legal documents claiming that Eleanor's deceased husband had sold him the water rights before dying, probably hoping that a simple fraudulent transfer would be easier to defend than trying to eliminate a child who had legal representation and community support. The critical problem with Thorne's fraudulent scheme was that there remained an official copy of Thomas Finch's original filing in the Territorial Registry Office in Cheyenne, complete with all the proper seals dates and legal documentation that proved beyond any doubt when the legitimate claim had been established and who held legal title to the water rights. As long as Mabel was alive and that original document continued to exist in the official files, Thorne's elaborate forgery was completely worthless and could be exposed by anyone with access to the territorial records. From beneath a loose floorboard in his cabin, Jeb produced a carefully preserved page that had been torn from a mine accounting ledger and hidden away as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The page contained detailed records of regular payments made to various territorial officials over a period of several years, creating a clear paper trail of systematic corruption that implicated numerous people in positions of trust and authority. According to the documented evidence, Sheriff Pike had been receiving $200 monthly for 3 years in exchange for ignoring criminal activities and refusing to investigate complaints against Thorne's operations. Vance Proctor, Thorne's chief enforcer and professional killer, received $50 monthly plus substantial performance bonuses for special assignments that probably included murder, intimidation, and other violent crimes. Most significantly, 2 territorial clerks had been paid large sums to alter official government documents and provide advance warning of any investigations or legal proceedings that might threaten Thorne's interests. I kept this page when they fired me and tried to run me out of the territory. Jeb explained with grim satisfaction and obvious pride in his foresight. Figured that someday it might prove useful for bringing down Thorne's entire criminal operation and getting justice for all the people he's hurt over the years. Caleb studied the incriminating ledger page with growing excitement and professional interest, recognizing immediately that they now possessed the kind of solid documentary evidence that could bring in federal marshals and result in lengthy prison sentences for everyone involved in the conspiracy. This constitutes rock-solid proof of systematic corruption and criminal conspiracy, he announced with obvious satisfaction. Combined with the girl's testimony about the attack on her family, the forged court documents we've already identified, and the physical evidence we've collected, we can build a case strong enough to put Thorne and his entire organization away for decades. But their premature celebration was cut short by a devastating development that changed the entire dynamic of their situation and transformed them from potential prosecutors into hunted fugitives. That afternoon, as they prepared to continue their dangerous journey toward Ash River, Mine professionally printed, wanted posters began appearing simultaneously in Dusty Fork and every other settlement trading post and transportation hub within a 50-mile radius of their location. The posters offered a substantial $300 reward for the capture of Tokala, who was described in official language as a dangerous Indian kidnapper and child abuser, who had violently abducted Mabel Finch from her legal guardian and was believed to be traveling with criminal confederates who were helping him evade justice. The documents bore Sheriff Pike's official signature and department seal, lending them an appearance of complete legitimacy that would convince most honest citizens to cooperate with the manhunt. More disturbing still, the posters included what appeared to be Deputy Caleb Holt's personal endorsement and official authorization of the manhunt, complete with a forged signature that was skillful enough to fool anyone who didn't know Caleb personally. "They've made it look like I'm actively participating in hunting you down," Caleb said, staring at the poster with complete disbelief and growing anger at the sophistication of the deception. "Anyone who sees this will think I've turned against you and am working with Pike to bring you in for the reward money." The diabolical brilliance of Thorne's propaganda strategy became immediately apparent to all of them as they considered its likely effects on their mission and their chances of survival. Every bounty hunter, part-time deputy citizen looking for easy money, and freelance gunfighter throughout Wyoming Territory would now be actively hunting Tokala with the belief that they were performing a public service by capturing a dangerous criminal who threatened innocent children. Even if they eventually managed to prove Tokala's complete innocence and expose the truth about Thorne's criminal activities, the immediate effect of the wanted posters was to transform him from heroic rescuer into hunted fugitive with a substantial price on his head that would attract every gun in the territory. The poster campaign effectively weaponized the legal system itself against them, turning truth and justice upside down. Through the simple expedient of official-looking lies backed by the full authority of corrupt law enforcement. $300 will bring every gun for hire in Wyoming Territory down on our heads like a swarm of angry wasps, Louisa observed with grim accuracy and obvious concern for their safety. "We can't use any of the main roads anymore, and we can't trust anyone we encounter along the way, even people who might normally be inclined to help strangers in need." The wanted posters represented Thorne's masterstroke in manipulating public perception and official authority to serve his criminal purposes. Even honest lawmen in distant counties would arrest Tokala on sight, believing completely that they were capturing a dangerous criminal and child abuser, rather than helping to perpetuate an elaborate fraud designed to cover up murder, theft, and systematic corruption.